Hollywood is facing its first strike in 15 years after a 6-week negotiation between screenwriters and movie studios collapsed. Almost 98% of the Writers Guild of America voted in favor of authorizing the strike, and their 11,500 members are demanding greater pay and greater transparency from their employers. Much of the dispute has to do with streaming. Under the traditional broadcast model, writers produce roughly 22 scripts per season and earn royalties if the show performs well. But streaming series are usually 8 to 10 episodes, and royalty payments are much more limited. Also at issue is AI. The WGA's contract demands that studios do not use AI to write scripts, and also that the writer's own work is not used to train AI models. Thousands of writers picketed in New York and LA last week. Several late-night shows went dark. And while streamers have a backlog of content to serve in the meantime, the pressure is on to produce more. Scott, we had a long discussion about this yesterday. You feel that people are misplacing the blame. Can you take us through your thoughts?
Yeah, so in typical Hollywood fashion, there's all of these shots of famous actors standing shoulder to shoulder with their union brothers and sisters on the picket line saying, "I stand with the writers." And, that's adorable. But, and there are some real contrasts here, as there always is, between kind of the working class, if you will, and management. Particularly David Zaslav, the CEO of Warner Brothers Discovery, who made $39 million last year, and get this, $250 million the year before, where they had a fantastic show called No Mercy, No Malice with Scott Galloway. 5 episodes, Ed. Anyways,
canceled it.
Look, as is always the case, at the end of the day, the culprit here is the end consumer and how much money they're spending or not spending. And what you have is, as evidenced by the fact that the ratings across the cable news networks, whether it's Fox or CNN, which have absolutely collapsed their viewership, the model is changing. And the model is more of an equity model than a revenue model. What do I mean by that? The streamers for a while were able to attract enormous market capitalization because the market valued growth over profits. And they overinvested, and now they're all, or most of them, are in a situation where they're not making nearly as much money. In addition, consumers aren't interested in watching late night with Jimmy Kimmel every night as much for 60 minutes where they can run 12 or 18 minutes of ads. That's an incredible business when you're running that many ads every night. And that supported a lot of writers who were very busy, and there was a lot of cash. There was a lot of money coming from the manufacturers of Nissans and opioid-induced constipation medication. And now that it's gone to streaming and consumers can get a ton of content for $12, you just have a different economic model. So unless you had options for whatever reason in Netflix, there's just less cash to go around. Mm-hmm. The industry is not getting bigger. And the studios are saying, all of a sudden, the market wants us to be profitable. We aren't. Our ad revenues are collapsing. And quite frankly, they just have the upper hand because a lot of the shows they're producing now don't need the same gross tonnage of writing strength or writing kind of heft or writers, if you will. There's just fewer of them needed. Mm-hmm. The other interesting part is about the AI, and that is I think the union it does make sense for them to say we need to put in place IP protection that if a script or a bunch of scripts from Modern Family get fed into an LLM and inform it such that AI can be used to draft scenes and scripts, then they should be compensated. Mm-hmm. But the notion that they should somehow put the kibosh on a technology is just fucking ridiculous. That's like saying we don't want you to use typewriters because that'll replace us. That's just a non-starter. Yeah. What I think you're going to see here is my understanding is a lot of the streamers banked a lot of content. I think all of the big guys have sort of looked at each other and winked and said, it's grown-up time. We've got to cut costs. We've got to hold the line here. I think this is going to be a strike that's going to go on for a while. I think there's probably a lot of distance between the parties, and I don't think the corporations or the streamers are going to give in. I think they realize their model has been flipped upside down. It's a poor economic model. They have got to cut costs. They have no choice. And this strike will not only have economic ramifications around what they pay writers, but it'll set the tone for future negotiations with different unions across the entertainment industry. So I think it's about to get awfully chilly in Los Angeles. I think you're going to see a lot of people out of work, at least temporarily. And the thing I don't understand about this industry is that the shows I worked on or try to work on, the writers have a lot of power. I'm shocked that they're not exceptionally well compensated because I'm trying to turn my book, The Four, my first book, Ed, New York Times bestseller. I'm trying to convert it into an original scripted series, sort of what Succession was to.
I did not know that. That's awesome.
Yeah, it is
Sorry,
awesome. You're not on the A team here. We don't let you in on stuff like this. But what Succession was to family-owned media, or Billions was to hedge funds, we're trying to do the same thing around big tech. And the reason my agent got so excited was we got a fantastic writer attached to the project. And it just strikes me that kind of the center of gravity around getting a project going and getting distribution is around getting a great writer. So I'm shocked that I'm just surprised that writers feel that it hasn't worked. And just more generally, I don't think unions work. I think they do it. I think they're the perfect enemy. I think they do a shitty job of assessing the situation. They're easily atomized and beaten. I don't think they work. And obviously there are some good unions that do a good job, but for the most part, I just don't think they represent the labor force well.
Yeah. Part of the issue here is that with these streaming shows, there are, with the network shows, you have 20 episodes, and with the streaming shows, you have like 8 to 10 episodes. And then if you just look at the median weekly pay over the past decade, if you adjust for inflation, it's declined around 23%. And that's for episodic television. If you look at movies, it's declined around 14%. And if you look at what they're actually demanding, what they want is around $429 million a year. I generally agree with everything that you've said thus far, but I think the main thing that one of the first things that the writers would point to is the CEO compensation that you mentioned. So CEOs of these TV companies are making around $40 million a year. Bob Iger made $46 million, Ted Sarandos made $38 million, and then you mentioned David Zaslav, who made like $250 million last year. Isn't it on them to start cutting their pay packages dramatically in order to serve the interests of the writers? Or what do you think?
Oh, isn't that adorable? Isn't that adorable that you would think these individuals would sacrifice? Come on, man. You're a CEO. And you've worked your whole life. You've kissed a ton of ass, played Game of Thrones politically. You're finally the CEO. And your buddy Bob, who became CEO of Viacom or whatever, made $200 million in 5 years. You're really going to decide to be a good guy and cut your pay? No, you're going to clock as many Benjamins as you can because you worked your ass off. And no one says at your funeral, and, Joe or Lisa was such a good person, she took 60 million instead of 120 during their 6-year run at Marvel or whatever. That's just, yeah, that's all fine and good until it's you. And then, you're going to reach your hand as far and as deep as possible into the barrel. What this reflects is just a broader trend in society, and that is CEO pay has gone from about 30 times the average workers' compensation to about 300. And the primary reason is that boards decide the compensation of the CEO. The CEO is generally a very likable guy or gal. You get to know them, and these compensation consultants come back, and I've been on these boards and say, okay, this is a streaming media company that does $3 billion a year. The average compensation for a media company at $3 billion is $11 million a year. That would be 50. 0 to 100, 50 is average. And we all go, but Lisa's working really hard and is a good person. We got to pay her at least 60. And you think, okay, that's not a big deal. But when you're paying people 1.2 times the previous year's average, essentially what you have is in 5 years, it's 1.2 to the fifth power, and their compensation is doubling every 3 or 4 years. So it's runaway compensation. And then the next year, the studies come back with something that says, well, actually, now average compensation for the same CEO of the same company is $13 million. Even just one level down, the COO, the CFO make dramatically less. And I'm not sure there's anything we can do about it because we assign too much credit and too much blame to the top guy or gal. So getting the right guy or the right gal, you pay up. I've been on these boards where we just have to hold our nose and give them a pay package that is just so outrageous. But you got to pay market. These people will do a market check and find out, well, if I go over to Comcast, I'm going to make this much money. I think the only way you address this is with and it's not a solution here, but it's one thing, is that at a minimum, we need to have a more progressive tax structure. And that is, if you're making over $1 million a year, you should probably pay higher taxes and not be privy to things like opportunity zones or long-term capital gains. I mean, the Social Security tax, Ed, let's say you're making $150,000 a year, you pay $9,000 a year, or approximately 6% in Social Security taxes. If I make $1.5 million a year, I pay, wait for it, $9,000 a year. Social Security tax tops out at $160K. That makes it a regressive tax. So this just reflects what has happened across every industry, and that is income inequality within the industry. CEO compensation is out of control. I don't know if there's anything you can do about it. What you can do is at least have them pay their fair share of taxes. But at the end of the day, you said that, what was the stat that the average compensation on an inflation-adjusted basis has gone down 23%?
23% in the past decade, yeah.
Okay, but look at what's happened to your expenditures on the consumption of great content. Yep. You are now spending at least 23% less. When I was your age, I had to pay $100 to $150 so I could get Food Networks 4, 5, and 6 because I wasn't allowed to have HBO or CNN unless I had the Food Network and Bravo and all this other shit that they bundled in. And also there was so much regulatory capture with cable companies that they figured out a way to be the only cable company in all of Manhattan. Mm-hmm. And so they would raise prices. And then that mother of all chins was met by a fist of stone called Netflix. But the bottom line is there's just a lot less money to go around because people your age can now spend $12 a month instead of $100 or $150 and get amazing content. Maybe you double up and you go 24 Netflix and HBO. Actually, it's a good question. Where do you spend money on media? And then there's one other huge elephant in the room that we'll talk about. But how much money do you spend on media every month?
Oh, God, I don't know. I honestly canceled a lot of my subscriptions because I just haven't been watching television.
Well, case in point.
Yeah.
Not enough money.
Yeah.
Okay,
but
so
I'm
zero.
not a good example, but I'm your perfect example, yeah.
Are you saying that just because you think that chicks will dig it, that you're you read and you don't watch a lot of TV? Are you at home watching Keeping Up with the Kardashians 18 hours a day?
No, it's even worse. I'm in the YouTube K-hole. I'm just obsessed with YouTube.
Okay, so there's YouTube. And then the other elephant in the room here is the writers aren't competing against David Zaslav or streaming. What they're really competing against is TikTok.
Yeah.
And that is the most valuable consumers in the world are teenagers and young adults because they're stupid and they spend a lot of money on dumb things like high-margin coffee and tennis shoes and apparel. And so advertisers love them. And here's the problem. They're not watching TV. They're watching TikTok. In addition, here's who the writers are competing against. There's 1.7 billion people on TikTok. Half of them are creators. Mm-hmm. So you have a talent pool that's the depth of the Mariana Trench, or 850 million people who are working for, get this, zero. Mm-hmm. Now, granted, they're not nearly the same quality as the 500,000 people employed by the streaming networks. But if you have 850 million creators, assume 1% are really talented, that's 8.5 million creators creating content for next to nothing that the consumer loves and is spending more time watching that free content instead of watching HBO or watching CNN or watching ESPN or what have you. So the bottom line is the tail that's wagging the dog here and who they should be picketing against is you, Ed.
Yeah.
And that's the bottom line. You're not spending as much time or money on traditional ad-supported television that supported a plethora of writers such that we could all tune into the Big Bang Theory every week.
Yeah. No, it feels like a lot of this is a question of who actually holds the power here. And more specifically, how powerful are the writers, in fact? And one detail that I found really interesting from this guy, Rich Greenfield, who's an analyst, who's a media analyst at Lightshed, he points out that the longer that you prolong this strike, it could actually mean boosted profits for a lot of these companies because a lot of them already have a massive backlog of content and they don't need to be producing more. They don't need to be increasing their expenses. And then there are also a lot of companies, specifically Netflix, who have a massive library of international shows and they can continue producing those international shows. And so to me, what we're finding out here, it's like a very tough, difficult economic negotiation of who actually has the power here. And I think basically in agreement with you, what we're going to find more and more is that writers actually don't have as much power as they think they do. And that's a shame, and that sucks. But it just feels like in a negotiation, ultimately the economic truth is going to win out here. And I think that an economic truth is that probably a lot of those writers are likely should be out of a job. But, you know, that's a tough truth to say, and who knows if it actually is the truth. But
so why do you hate writers, Ed? No, you're exactly right. This is capitalism, or the invisible hand of the market, and
yeah,
regardless of whether Bob Odenkirk marches and shows up, and all these photo moments that are just such radical virtue signaling from actors who are making $10 or $20 million a year because they're in the 0.1%, standing with their brothers and sisters on the picket line. It's gonna get ugly. For the writers here.
We should mention this one final point, which is residuals, and that's what a lot of the residuals is another word for royalties, basically, and that's been a big point of contention. So basically, residuals from streaming are way lower than residuals from cable. One thing that the studios pointed out is that the residuals actually hit an all-time high in 2021. The WGA's response to that is that the only reason it's hit an all-time high is because so many more programs are being made. So on a per program basis, residuals are actually way down. Now, the studios haven't responded to that, but what I assume that they would say is, well, look, we're making more programs, which means we're making more jobs, we're employing more writers, so you probably have a choice here, which is we can pay more to the best writers of the best shows, or we can depress the salaries of all of the writers on a per writer basis and give more jobs to writers.
There are some similarities here between big tech and what's going on in media, and that is big tech. They couldn't hire fast enough, and they stuffed so many calories down the esophagus of big tech that there was fatty deposits everywhere. I got to think employment is way up with the streaming wars over the last 20 years, and I'm evidence of that. When an angry professor with ED can get 3 TV shows greenlit in 3 or 4 years, it probably means they're reaching too far into the barrel. And I'm only being half serious or half kidding. Everything, I would imagine that employment has gone up dramatically, and similar to big tech, I think these companies are going to wake up and go, you know what? We could lose a third of our writers. They could go decide, to sell real estate or do something else, and we wouldn't miss them. And I think that is the ugly truth around what is going to happen in terms of the shakeout here. I mean, in sum, Netflix has trained every consumer to expect more for less. And that worked as long as the stock was going up based on subscriber growth. When the markets finally said, all right, now it's about profitability, the whole industry woke up and said they needed to cut costs. And they're going to cut costs across every dimension, including writers.
So Mia actually went to one of the writers' strikes today in New York, and she spoke to a lot of the writers. So she is probably far more equipped to opine on this than we are. Mia, what did you hear from them?
Hey, Ed. So, yeah, I did go to Greenpoint, Brooklyn today to go join some of the picketers. They were picketing on the set of what was supposed to be filming for FBI Most Wanted. So that was kind of fun. And they were covering an entire block. They were joined by members of the Screenwriters Guild, and they were supported by cars going by, honking. It was actually a really heartwarming scene, honestly. I think I harbored some skepticism of how effective unions are, like you both did. And then when I went, it was really kind of inspiring seeing everyone come together. And I talked to a bunch of these people, and there were some surprising takeaways. First of all, these writers do understand that these cable and streaming companies have obligations to their shareholders, and they have profit obligations, but they also believe that these companies have an obligation to pay their writers a livable wage.
And yeah, we've seen writers go from being able to earn a livable wage in New York and LA, the cities where this industry mainly is, to poverty levels, basically. I mean, like, to be able to get into a writer's room is harder than it's ever been. And then once you're there, that's absolutely no guarantee that you're going to be able to live in the city where you have to be working. It's insane.
In network, the more money a show makes for that network, the more residuals we get paid. Like if they syndicated a bunch, we get more residual checks. But streamers have been very opaque about how many views their shows get, how many subscriptions a given show is driving.
The streaming companies are holding their data hostage. They, for a while, took this ridiculous position that they didn't know how many people had streamed a show, and it's like, no, this is what we're dealing with on the other side. They're straight up lying to us constantly, and using like these, like, oh well, you know, it's all a bunch of really difficult decisions because like, well, what if someone just streams it for 2 seconds? Should that count as a whole stream? And it's like, sure, there are details to be worked out, but to hide behind that as an excuse for basically not paying people anything is absurd.
And they also were surprisingly unfazed by the threat of AI.
I mean, it's a stochastic parrot, right, as they say. So it's very good at giving you what the predictable next thing is. And if you want more predictable things in the world, then I guess that's what you want.
My fear is that the studio executives don't care about the job being done well. They care about it being done cheaply, and you can see in the sort of like list of proposals and counter proposals that the Guild published, like AI was a topic that the studios full on refused to engage on at all.
Studios don't even want to talk about it. It's like the third rail for them because they have their plans already in motion.
The fact that they're not brave enough to say, of course we're interested in humans telling human stories is so lousy and has definitely motivated me.
You know, I'm sure it's as good as some weak writers and not as good as some strong writers, but it's only going to get stronger. It's been around for 7 minutes, and so it's developing faster than I think we as humans can, so that's challenging.
I think it would work the way a lot of capitalism works, meaning that it would make a few people so much money and it would make the rest of us hate every second of our lives. In that sense, total success.
I think there should be one union. I was in a union when I was younger. I'm technically still in a union, I think, as my classification as a prof at NYU. Somehow I'm with the AFL-CIO, or yeah, and I think it's a consortium of unions. I don't think it's a specific union, but it's a consortium. I think there should be one union, and it should be the federal government that raises minimum wage to $25 an hour. I'm not sure. I think they might need representation for something like this because it's a complicated business. But we'll see. I don't know the ins and outs, and this will go to my prediction. I think the studios have the upper hand here.